our interest was this intractable war, and we saw, I suppose, an opportunity to do something about it. Or we guessed, we had no idea whether we could pull it off or not.
You're listening to Catalyst Talks, conversations with change agents, outliers, superheroes, and truly conscious leaders modeling what it is to be an unstoppable force for good in this world. What lit these catalysts on fire to do their work, and what nuggets of wisdom can they share with a world literally on fire? This podcast is for you who cares deeply and seeks to catalyze the world. I'm your host, Stephanie Trager. I'm a consciousness catalyst and soul coach to superstar change agents in business, leadership, and life. In this podcast, I wear an eclectic mix of hats, including earthkeeper, healer, mindset coach, lawyer, business, sustainability, and impact strategist. My intention is holding space for higher purpose, peak wellness, and soul mastery so we can live in harmony with ourselves, each other, and nature. The whole idea of Catalyst Talks in these conversations is to awaken consciousness, unlock higher purpose, and learn what it really takes to catalyze change in that scale. Subscribe to our new podcast and help us grow. We're aiming to reach 1 million people at least in 2020. Let's wake up the world together. My guest today on Catalyst Talks podcast is Simon Taylor. I am so deeply honored to be in conversation with the co-founder and director of Global Witness. Go check out globalwitness.org. I have been an astute follower of this organization since its inception. Global Witness protects human rights and the environment by fearlessly confronting corruption and challenging the systems that enable it. They focus on the intersection of conflict, corruption, and natural resources. In 1993, he co-founded this organization, and their very first campaign was to shut down the Khmer Rouge's illegal logging industry. They uncovered the truth about blood diamonds and really helped spearhead the global campaign to end blood diamonds, and they have helped bring trillions of dollars in revenue in oil, gas, and mining industries to the open. They are known for shining a spotlight on the brutal killings of environmental and human rights defenders who are defending their land from forced seizure by corporations and governments alike. They've campaigned for an end to the use of anonymous companies and much more. Simon's work began the global call for transparency and accountability in the oil, gas, and mining sectors. And they really helped expose the relationship between extractive industries and the disproportionate impact of people who live in those resource-rich countries. Exposing corruption in these sectors led Global Witness to conceive of, and Simon co-launched this campaign in 2002 with other NGOs, to launch the Publish What You Pay campaign. In 2002, the UK government responded to the Publish What You Pay campaign and launched the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or EITI, and this is now a multi-stakeholder initiative that places civil society in the central role of holding governments and companies to account for the revenue streams developed from extraction. And Simon now serves as an international civil society board member of the EITI. This conversation is so powerful. Simon's stories are heroic and unique, and they are cause for inspiration. This is what it takes to catalyze change and at scale. Simon, thank you so much for being here with me. I am honored to be in conversation with you as a longtime consumer of the information your organization puts out, as a longtime activist inspired by your campaigns, the campaigns of Global Witness, which we'll dive in today. And I'm truly honored to be in your company in our work with Steven Donziger, the human rights attorney who took on Chevron. But I'm so grateful for all of your work, Simon. And for those listening, Simon is a co-founder of Global Witness, which is an NGO that shows the links between environmental exploitation and human rights abuses, mostly focused on the extractive industries in driving conflict, environmental destruction, corruption, and looting of resource-rich countries. And the organization offers strategies for addressing these critical issues. So, Simon, you've been at the forefront of highlighting the nexus of human rights abuse, corruption, and environmental degradation, conflict, anonymous companies, and I've been reading a lot about your work and the reports referencing the killing of environmental defenders for years, because my journey began in the 90s when an environmental activist friend of mine was killed with impunity here in the United States, in California. So from conflict minerals in the Democratic Republic of Congo to the palm oil industry in the Philippines to agribusiness, Global Witness continues to pump out credible, detailed investigative journalism, important campaigns, advocacy, and has been instrumental in government policy. So you, Simon, I want to hear about this person behind Global Witness, behind this organization, how it started, what you were doing until that time. So tell me about how Global Witness came to be.
Ooh, wow, that was a generous introduction. Thank you. So to take us back to our origins, I can only speak for myself, I guess, but I have two fellow founders, Charmian Gooch and Patrick Alley, and it was the three of us who set up Global Witness. So we all came with similar ideas, I guess, to the problems we saw in front of us at the time, and that it was our sort of meeting of minds around a set of issues that led to us making this decision. But I guess to take it even further back, we all met at an environmental organization called the Environmental Investigation Agency. Your listeners may well be familiar with some of its work. It was instrumental in what became known as the ivory trade ban during the 1980s. So the three of us worked at the Environmental Investigation Agency, which was set up by one of the founders of Greenpeace, one of the earlier sort of members of Greenpeace in Vancouver, who had come to London and was the founder of Greenpeace in the UK, what became the Greenpeace entity in the UK, and his two colleagues. They really sort of pioneered the use of undercover investigations techniques to really get to the root of a particular problem. In the case I just mentioned, the ivory trade, they basically went undercover following the trail of ivory from poacher all the way through to market, and uncovered how the International Secretariat under CITES, this was the UN system that if you like, policed the trade in endangered species. Individuals attached to the CITES Secretariat were involved in the laundering of CITES certificates, which enabled a massive trade in ivory way beyond what was permitted. I think it was something like, I'm trying to remember now, something like 10 times the permitted trade. And so it wasn't really a wonder that Africa's elephant population halved in less than a decade. So it gives you a little insight into EIA, which is where we all met. And when we were there, we really could see the amazing impact of accurate information which could put you in a position where you could discuss an issue and you could not be really argued with, because you knew exactly what you were talking about and had the evidence to back it up. And the subsequent strategic deployment of that evidence could move mountains with very little. So EIA was a very small organization. When I showed up there as a volunteer, I think it was, I can't remember now, maybe 10, 11, 12 people, something like that. And it was a totally inspiring place. It operated out of 2 rooms in London. There was work going on in Washington, but really out of someone's flat. The 2 rooms in London, if you got up to go to the loo or grab your lunch, you came back and someone else had stolen your desk. But it was totally inspiring. This work was thriving and going on around us. And so that was the place I came into from outside of this sort of field. And I just found it the most extraordinarily sort of thrilling and exciting place to work. And that's really where I met Charmian and Patrick. And maybe to cut this story short to the beginning of Global Witness, we through the work of EIA, we kept encountering examples of cases where it was very hard to say, okay, that's an environmental problem, or it's a human rights problem. Where does one begin and the other end? And one of the, I suppose, the earlier examples that we used to cite that sort of tried to clarify, it was our effort to try and clarify our thinking around why we sort of centered on this nexus, was the example of the ivory trade across the, out of Mozambique. So elephants were being poached, and the ivory was being traded across the border with to South Africa in return for, I guess, ammunition, bombs, and what have you. So was that an environmental problem? Well, yes, it was, because it was leading to the despeciation of elephants in Mozambique gradually. Was it a human rights problem? Yes, it also was, because this was one of the key funding routes, not the only one, but one of the key funding routes that was bankrolling essentially, or providing material for the conflict in Mozambique. And it seemed impossible to really address the loss of elephants by just talking about the problem of loss of elephants without taking into account the role it played in driving the conflict. And so for us, that was really the birth of thinking, well, actually, these things are not in silos, they're all interconnected. And to address these, sometimes massive problems that lead to profoundly different destinies in the historical context of what happens in a whole state, one really needs to think about both of these areas. And the area we were really all focused on and concerned about was the, at that point, still ongoing civil war in Cambodia. And in Cambodia at that time, we had just seen the biggest UN peacekeeping mission in history, some 21,000 troops, I think, from memory. The first use of Japanese troops overseas since World War II in a peacekeeping format, obviously. The leader of the UN mission, known as UNTAC, was a Japanese diplomat. So Japan had a lot of diplomatic prestige on show to bring this conflict to an end. And that UN mission brought about an election, but the civil war carried on going. And why was it going? Because the Khmer Rouge, who by that time, the genocidal Khmer Rouge who committed genocide during their period of control in the 1970s, were basically stationed with their forces around the border with Thailand, and they were exporting timber into Thailand in return for munitions and other supplies. And literally everybody was ignoring this. So as the world was pronouncing peace in Cambodia, people were still dying from a conflict that hadn't stopped, except the official narrative was that it had. So we decided, wow, someone should really use these kinds of investigative techniques, as we had seen so beautifully used by the Environmental Investigation Agency in its work on ivory and other issues. And then we sort of thought about how that could work. And the more we looked around, the more we realized there really wasn't anyone to do it. And in a sort of peak of craziness, I suppose, we were all sitting in a pub. All the best ideas happen in a pub. And we thought, well, why don't we? And that was really the birth of Global Witness. We decided we were going to shut the Thai border, thereby cutting off the export of logs from the Khmer Rouge and thereby terminating their source of money and their supplies. So that was the beginning of us. Of course, we had no money. So it took a little while, obviously, before we could get going. But that was the beginning.
We decided we're going to shut off the Thai border. So that's a big effort. What did you do first?
A piece of megalomania. Well, the first thing we did was decided to go and collect money in tube stations in London, in the underground system. And we decided to do that because at the Environmental Investigation Agency, that had worked very well. And it was kind of soul destroying, as you'll hear. We turn up in, for those who know the London Underground system, we turn up in Bank Station. At EIA, this would work quite well because Bank was the place where obviously a lot of well-endowed financiers would come to work in the morning, and coughing up £1 in your collecting tin was relatively low cost for them. So it was quite easy to come away with a reasonable supply of money that would have bankrolled your telephone costs, your basic research costs, and so on, which would have enabled us to get going. So we decided to do the same thing. And rather to our frustration, we get up at 5 in the morning, turn up at Bank, and everyone would go out of the other exits because nobody had ever heard of us. And so we would do these painful trips to raise money. Officially, of course, you had to get permission from the station, so it was all legitimate, of course. But we'd go home with £6.50, which was barely enough to cover the cost of getting there in the first place. So it was absolutely soul-destroying. And this continued for, I guess, about 7-8 months. And the combination of the paltry sums we would raise doing these station collections, and we got donations from friends and what have you. I think at the end of this period where we just couldn't face that anymore, we had something like £1,000 we'd managed to collect together, mostly from donations from friends, I hasten to add. And so we decided to be grown up and get an office. So we had an office, and we had enough money to pay the rent on the office for, I think, 4 weeks plus the bills. And at that point, I went, yippee, onto salary. So I was paid £60 a week, and we had enough money to pay me for 4 weeks before I'd have to go straight back off salary again. And it was in that first 4 weeks of sort of looking real that we got our first grant. And we got our grant from an organization in the Netherlands, which is now part of the Oxfam family. And that put us in business. So with that, we bought ourselves our equipment. We built our secret camera. We obviously had, well, as individuals, we had stills cameras, but we had to obtain and construct a secret camera, all the equipment for that. We bought ourselves an early GPS. This is pre-GPSs with maps on them, so just the coordinates. We bought ourselves an air ticket, and we went to Bangkok, and we hired ourselves a pickup truck, and we'd had business cards sort of printed off with false names and a fake business company. And we basically traveled around the Thai border. I think we did something like 6,000 kilometers going up and down every single side road to every single location we could find. And we'd go and hit the border until we hit the Thai military, who would stop us. And we found all the what were called log rest areas. So the places where the timber that was coming across would be put in fields, basically. We found all of these locations. We documented them, you know, filming them, taking stills photographs, and we of course took the GPS coordinates so we could find them again and place them on a map precisely. And we conducted business interviews as our undercover business personas, and basically interviewed the owners and the managers of these companies. They were more sort of mafia style companies, and it was amazing. You know, we were asking, you know, we want to buy your logs. What kind of species are they? What volumes are they? Who did you get them from? All this kind of stuff. And within a couple of trips, we knew pretty much every company that was involved. We knew their corporate structure. We knew who they were owned by, or at least some idea in some cases. We knew who they'd done business with. They had provided us documentation. We even obtained a hermetically sealed checkpoint passes issued by the Khmer Rouge to the drivers, because the truck drivers would go across the border, which in most cases was literally a few hundred meters away. They'd drive into Cambodia, which was Khmer Rouge occupied territory, pick up the logs and drive back again. And that's where we were finding their products. You know, they were coming out and being stored in these locations. And so we would conduct these interviews, and basically the people we interviewed on the basis of buying logs, which we never did, told us everything. So by the end of our second investigation, which was, I guess, in March 1995, we knew that the Khmer Rouge during the height of the dry season were making just under $20 million a month from this trade, and it tapered off at each end. Obviously, in the height of the dry season, they could do a round trip in, I don't know, 5, 6 hours, 4 hours, whatever it was. In the height of the rainy season, where they just came to a grinding halt, that trip would turn into literally 24 hours, and they couldn't do it anymore. So the Khmer Rouge were making, stretched out over the year, somewhere between 10 and 20 million a month, which was more than enough to bankroll their 3,000 or so fighters at the time. And that's how they carried on their war. We then held a press conference. This was bizarre. We held this press conference, which was the idea of our guide, in fact, who was a Thai environmental journalist. And she called her fellow journalist friends together. So we held this press conference and basically accused the various people who we could uncover and prove who were involved of bankrolling the Khmer Rouge's war effort, which we weren't quite sure how that would be received. And the next day we went to the airport to fly to Phnom Penh to carry on our work inside Cambodia. And it went front page. I remember one of the headlines, I forget which newspaper it was, something like the Bangkok Post or whatever. It said, Chuan, he was the Prime Minister at the time, denies Global Witness report. we couldn't believe it. Nobody had ever heard of us. We thought we'd get a paragraph on page 40 or something, but it was right across the top of the front page. And we thought we were going to get arrested because we'd heard stories of people complaining about the government and that happening to them. But nothing happened. We got on the plane. When we arrived in Phnom Penh, the mixture of journalists in Phnom Penh, there were quite a lot of foreign journalists there because Pol Pot was in his various throes of losing or various bits of the conflict had happened and were ongoing, and people were interested in documenting what was going on. And lots of journalists wanted to know us all of a sudden. It was quite fascinating. We'd gone from absolutely nobody had ever heard of us to suddenly we were these kind of famous lunatics who had just exposed this massive sort of blatant trade across the border, which everyone was pretending wasn't happening. And I remember one of the boss of the Thai military at the time said, I still remember what he said. He said, logs are not toothpicks. You can't hide them in a suitcase. And one of the journalists asked us what we thought of that. And we said, well, he's absolutely right. If we can see them, how come he can't? And then we sort of proposed a few alternatives. Well, he's either blind, his staff are lying to him, or he's part of the problem. Take your pick. And they printed that the front page the next day. And so it went on. We later found, probably about a year later, we didn't find out at the time, that in fact 3 days after this argument had been going on, the Thais shut the border and it cut off the Khmer Rouge of their income. And that was basically their financial flow cut. And
Wow.
something like they tried to open the border again at various stages because there was complicity at high level on both sides of the border, of course. But they never managed it because every time they tried, we'd do another investigation and expose them, and the border stayed shut. Yeah, I mean, just over a year later, something like 60% of the Khmer Rouge on the western side of Cambodia defected to the government. And I don't want to put us on a pedestal beyond what we deserve. There were other factors involved as well. The slow but gradual sort of disintegration of the sort of integrity of the Khmer Rouge as a fighting force, and its leadership was getting old, and all sorts of other factors too. But we do think the total lack of cash flow seriously undermined their capacity to function. So it played a very key role, we think, in their sort of ultimate demise.
I can only imagine the heroic stories that you have to tell for each of these issues. I mean, you set out on a mission, you did it. I'm curious to know how this win of sorts led to the next issue and then the next issue, and then to hire people and to scale and to grow into the organization that you have today.
I guess we've grown organically, and almost it feels now in retrospect sort of almost with you blink and wow, where did all these people come from? It's not obviously quite like that, but I guess looking back, I would say our interest was this intractable war, and we saw, I suppose, an opportunity to do something about it. Or we guessed, we had no idea whether we could pull it off or not, and I wouldn't want to suggest we were naive to the risks of doing that, but we also thought if we did the undercover story right and stuck to our guns, we could do it with reasonable security. And we thought that the deployment of this information would have a devastating impact on the status quo, which it turned out to be, but we weren't sure whether we could pull it off. So that was our sort of premise, I suppose. Not long after this, I guess we're about 2 years into our existence, our former boss from the Environmental Investigation Agency approached us and really tried to suggest it would be great if we were to look at the role of diamonds in the funding of another intractable war, this time in Angola, between the UNITA guerrilla movement of Jonas Savimbi and the government under the political leadership of the so-called MPLA, which was bankrolled on the other side by oil. Because Angola was at that stage an up-and-coming oil major source of new oil production in Africa. And so you had another civil war driven in the post-Cold War era by a necessity to exploit natural resources, because the sort of Cold War era financing from the East and the West on one side or the other had basically dried up, or at least in substantial quantities had dried up. And so the fighting protagonists, if wars didn't peter out at the end of the Cold War, could only carry on by seeking other sources of funding. And in the Khmer Rouge case, they had external support until the peace process that led to the UNTAC mission that I described before. But it sort of evaporated after that, with the exception of what became a business relationship between Thai mafia / political / military interests and the Khmer Rouge. So it was just a straightforward business relationship. It was all about money. And for the Khmer Rouge, they needed money to buy their supplies, and that's why they went to timber. They tried rubies and sapphires before that, but timber became the mainstay. In the Angolan case, diamonds funded Jonas Savimbi's UNITA, and oil funded the government, and that was our sort of next foray. So we originally thought about looking at diamonds and decided actually we weren't going to do it. And after, I guess, a few months of watching the sort of stability, semi-war, semi-peace arrangement in Angola at the time starting to disintegrate, we decided to do it. So we began an investigation into the diamond industry, thinking, well, if we can shut down the diamond industry in Angola, it will take money away, just like the Khmer Rouge issue, take money away from UNITA, and they'll have to sue for peace. Great idea. And it was only when we got there we realized the enormous involvement of oil and the complicity of the oil sector itself in basically the bankrolling of the war effort by the government side. But you might say that's legitimate. It's the government dealing with an internal insurgency. But it was also the mainstay of vast revenues that were being looted by the elite. And by the time we showed up, I think the Civil War situation, which then re-kicked off again in the late 90s, had started to become an excuse to loot the country. That's not to say it wasn't a legitimate, not a wrong choice of words. That's not to say it wasn't a real fight. It was when it kicked off again. But very soon it was clear the government was winning, and its continuation of the conflict became a convenience to cover up the looting operation. So that was a sort of context in which we arrived. And so we decided to pick up and start working on the diamond industry, and then rapidly realized we couldn't work on one without working on the other. So we simultaneously began investigating the oil sector as well. And throughout this period, and indeed even when we were still working mainly on the Cambodia issue, we had begun to have a sort of gravitational pull of volunteers who would come in and work with us. We did a number of investigations both in and around Angola with people who had volunteered, and we'd begun to be able to hire because we brought in additional funds to work in these areas. And so gradually we sort of added projects, I suppose, because they became the next thing we had to do. In the Angolan case, this led to us eventually in late 1998 launching a campaign about diamonds. This was the birth of the so-called blood diamonds issue. You may have seen the film with Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah.
That's sort of obviously much more of a focus on what happened in Sierra Leone and West Africa, which was also another diamond fueled conflict. But the blood diamonds issue really began in Angola, and then we were able, with other organizations, to add in the situation in West Africa as well. And so some of that, the whole sort of the situation in terms of how diamonds were bankrolling things was quite, I think, quite nicely captured for popular consumption. Of course, it's a Hollywoodization of things, but there are some bits in that film which are very close to reality. Obviously, the background story, romance, and so on is somewhat different than reality. But what was going on was quite a good portrayal of just the hideousness of how, this ultimate gift of love apparently was basically being used for mass homicide. And that was really our concern, that we needed to see the diamond industry remove its association with buying diamonds from conflict zones because it was paying for misery on a very large scale.
I was young around that time of 1998, and I remember all of this. And I remember Global Witness back then as a budding activist. So, yeah, I mean, and one of the things is that as an activist, you connect dots. And this is what you at Global Witness, what you guys were doing, right? You're connecting one
Yeah,
dot to the next.
well, for us, it just seemed like a totally logical continuum. I suppose I remember thinking, oh, well, here's just another endless conflict. What's the key to this? Money. Why is there money? Well, diamonds and oil. Okay, let's shut them down. How can we do that? We rapidly realized we had no hope of shutting down the oil industry. It was at that point something like 500,000 barrels a day of production, and within 4 or 5 years it was coming up to 1.8 million. So it was a massive expansion. I mean, to put that in context, that's not a whole lot off the volume that Nigeria produces or has produced at its maximum amount. So it made Angola after I suppose Libya first, then Libya, I guess, is North Africa, Middle East, I suppose, is often considered. But in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, Angola was the second producer of oil by that stage. And there was no way on this planet we could chase the oil industry out. But we did think we could hold them to account because there was absolute complicity through their opacity of operation, but actually much worse than that. We think clear signs of corruption, involvement in all sorts of interesting activities like arms deals through subsidiary companies that didn't exist on the books, this sort of thing. You start wondering, well, why is an oil company that claims it's just extracting oil in Cabinda, say, basically flying in weapons from Israeli state arms production companies into Luanda? What on earth is that about? And so we started to dig into a lot of this stuff and starting to look at, as I said before, we started off with diamonds, and the government position at that point when we launched our diamonds work, they were quite enamored by that because they saw it as anti-UNITA, their battlefield enemy. And interestingly, and by accident almost, when we launched that diamond work, it was literally days after the fourth civil war in Angola had commenced in December 98. And we launched our oil work 1 year later. And the government went from being really quite happy about what they saw as an anti-UNITA hit to sort of marching around the place and publicly claiming we were part of a global Machiavellian plot against them. And so it became quite a confrontational situation pretty soon after that. They decided to sue us. This was my baptism with English libel law. In the case of Cambodia, I wouldn't want to suggest we were flippant about libel, but we felt absolutely solid on our feet because we had filmed everyone. The evidentiary basis was so strong. We had it from the horse's mouth. People had given us documents and they had opened up and they'd said things that were completely incriminating. And we had that material on camera, and we could place where those interviews were precisely and so on. So there was a lot of extensive sort of material that supported our position. So I was never really worried about libel. And even not that I want to spend my time fighting libel actions because they're expensive, but I suppose I remember thinking when I did think about it, well, if someone has a go at us, it'll be quite fun because the material we have is so strong. It'll be interesting to see how we go on that. So I felt it would end quick. In this particular case, it was scary as hell because in Angola at that point, documents, you would be shown documents, but nobody would ever give you a document. And so we knew a lot about who the protagonists were, but we had no material, nothing that you could submit in a court case. So I spent probably 6 months, I suppose, at that time, worried about whether I had just sunk the organization. But in the end, some of the protagonists that we named got arrested in this enormous scandal that blew up in France that later became known as Angola Gate, which was all about money laundering through France. The the sort of systems of looting of Angola on the government side that were used also to procure weapons. And so this whole thing blew up, and the entire legal assault against us evaporated overnight. And that was really, at that point, I suppose, that's when I thought, okay, we have to really think about libel in a slightly different way. And it became for us more a case of going on the offensive. You can do this work, you can get your facts right, which I don't regret anything we said, but you can think of it more strategically in your approach. And I think that's shaped quite a lot of how we've dealt with really tough and difficult issues since.
Well, you said something a little bit back. You said, well, what was that about? You know, another one of those, what was that about? So, I mean, I would love to hear on maybe a handful of other, what was that about?
Well, I suppose I'm trying to think how to answer that one. I suppose throughout our existence, there are so many case studies now that we've looked at that sort of focus around this nexus of corruption that has driven war and has looted countries in many countries around the world. And I think one truism that certainly applies to me, and sometimes I think, gosh, after all this time, I really am still very naive. I often find myself going, I cannot believe someone did that. There are quite a few examples of that, I suppose. I mean, I remember, I don't know how much you followed the stories of mining in Guinea, for example. There's a company called Benny Steinmetz Group Resources, which acquired half of the Simandu iron ore concession, which at the time was touted as the largest iron ore concession in the world, or untouched iron ore concession in the world. They obtained it through bribing then President Conte's fourth wife, and very shortly after, they flipped half of their half, so a quarter of the whole concession, for $2.5 billion, which was touted as the deal of the century in the mining trade press. I mean, you really have to ask a question about how mining journalists think about this stuff. I mean, here's a country where here's someone who comes in within months, or not very long anyway, I forget the dates now, they flip a concession that's untouched for the equivalent of like 2.5, 3 years of the entire country's budget. And this is in a very poor country. You know there's something not quite right there. How is it we have extractive deals going on that are so favorable to the extractor and so detrimental to citizens on the ground? And this is where we get into this space of corruption and what equitable exploitation is, or what it shouldn't be, and what it all too often is. And how do we address that? And that's a problem that's getting worse and is compounded, obviously, by other crises that we're globally dealing with now, like the climate crisis. There is this sort of relentlessness to carry on extracting ever more resources, and especially around oil and gas, even though the markets are slipping away. So I'm constantly finding myself thinking, well, the narrative that is presented and all things being equal would seem normal just isn't normal. And so the reason I'm going on about this is throughout our existence, whether it's investigations that have exposed activities like the one I just mentioned in Guinea, or others, there's too many to name, I suppose, over time. But even just the framing by which we, in the trade press, in the Financial Times, in many other sort of mainstream press, how they describe these types of concessions and contracts and so on, the language used to describe the economics of normality, or as we would see it as normal, they're just not normal. And yet they sort of gloss over us in front. And it's only when you start picking them apart, you start to realize, well, this stinks in some way, or there's something really profoundly wrong. And I'm very often quite shocked by what we uncover. And I think the ultimate sort of answer to dealing with this stuff is to shine a big spotlight on it and uncover it and expose it and let the evidence speak for itself. And then it's quite interesting to see what the impacts are.
I'm so glad you took that turn because, well, it wasn't a turn, but I'm so glad you went in this direction, because what's been top of mind for me as I'm listening to you, Simon, is what's become a more mainstream narrative now around ESG, environmental, social, and
Yeah.
governance, right? And ESG and corporate social responsibility, and sustainable this and sustainable development, and smart this
Yeah.
and smart that. And really and before I took a little clip from what you said before, that the deployment of evidence could move mountains. And so a lot of these subject matter areas are being, let's just say, drowned with evidence, but yet still it feels very much like siloed from your work. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I'm trying to think of a sensible example. As one I was sort of, I suppose, insufficiently following to pursue. I had too many things on my plate, but I pursued it for a while. But just to illustrate exactly that phenomenon, or how it came across to me, fitting in the way you just described it, was the sort of official public narrative behind the so-called Southern Gas Corridor project in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
This is a sort of internationally and European financed effort to bring gas through a pipeline system to Europe, coming out of Azerbaijan, and there are a number of justifications provided by the political leadership across Europe, and I'm talking about both the European Commission that worked very centrally on this, but also some of the sort of offices of prime ministers and other, I suppose, national energy-focused ministries across different member states of the European Union, as to the justification for these projects. And the narrative went sort of something like, well, Europe needs more gas. Europe needs to Europe needs to have reliable supplies of gas, bearing in mind that gas was cut off at one point through the Ukraine a few years ago because of a spat between Ukraine and Russia. And that resulted in the cutting off of gas supply. And that's really problematic, given that gas production in the North Sea is now declining quite rapidly. So if not from the North Sea, the safe, reliable place for the last 20 years, we've got to get it from Russia, but we can't get it from Russia because Russia's unreliable, so we'll get it from another place. And so it goes on. Another claim has been, well, we need to get it because the states en route of this pipeline desperately, need gas because otherwise they'll have to burn coal. All of this stuff is sort of framed around a sort of narrative that these are the essential things we need to do. And it's also great because gas is a stepping stone to a renewable future.
Yeah. Can I just ask you something? So
yeah.
Is it, what is the gas coming from? Is it fracking?
Well, the gas is coming from Azerbaijan, but it's when you start taking apart these arguments and investigating them a bit further, you realize none of this stacks up. To begin with, the source at the front end of this pipeline, Azerbaijan, at the time, at least, I haven't checked in recently, couldn't supply enough gas, and it would have had to have been topped up by, guess where? Russia. So one of the central planks, the geostrategic need to avoid reliance on Russia, was simply not true. Europe doesn't need more gas. Its projections of gas supply demand are down, not up. The states in Southeastern Europe, yeah, sure, gas might be better than coal, but why go to gas at all? Why not go to renewables? They've got plenty of renewable options and they're cheaper. And so on and so forth. You just go through these arguments, they all fall away. And what was really fascinating is when you picked a fight with the financing agencies, so they were quite a few different ones, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank. So these are a few years ago now, so time's moved on, and they probably say, oh, well, that was then and this is now, and we think differently. The European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, they all lined up these excuses, these supporting requirements or justifications. But if you met people on the side and said, well, that's crap, what is your response? They would basically admit it. And their answer was, well, this came from politically on high. And then you find out there's this thing called the Azerbaijan laundromat scandal, in which some vast amount of money, I think something like 2 billion euros, was laundered through Europe and ended up, some of it, in the pockets of some of the key decision makers who made key strategic decisions around certain considerations by the Commission around human rights situation in Azerbaijan that could have led to a cutting off of financial relationships, but the report said there wasn't a human rights problem. This at a time when, fellow activists we work with were being arrested, arbitrarily thrown in jail and tortured, and we had handwritten notes from some of them describing how they were being tortured. So a lot of the justifications just did not stack up, and then you start to wonder, well, how much money greased how many palms? And I'm pretty sure, back to your point about ESG, this comes down to due diligence. I'm sure due diligence was done, but who did the due diligence and who set the terms of reference? And how was that collated? And so in the end, I think there's probably other factors too, like political leadership probably thinking, well, better the devil we know, because it's, we can rely on gas because we know what it is because we've used it for 100 years. And there'll be things like that too that have muddied the water in the decision-making process. But what's really fascinating I've found from that is that just because you have political leadership making claims around decisions like this, you shouldn't necessarily take them as credible, especially when you start picking them apart and finding that the supposed justifications are really not credible. And when you see that through the prism of the remaining carbon budget that we need to stay within if we're going to hold temperature rises below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we cannot afford mistakes like that. And so a lot of our work is now kind of moving out of the space of, I suppose, governance from the perspective of just improving the function of companies in the extractive sphere and into actually saying, well, hang on a minute, this doesn't stack up anymore. Some parts of our extractive sector simply have to go. So we've quite fundamentally as an organization moved on from thinking oil and gas needs to be better managed into oil and gas has to go. They need to be shut down. Obviously not overnight because we need a managed decline process, but we need all of the systems that are out there at our disposal, including the boards of these companies, to be aligned in a common focus, which needs to be how do we move out of our current paradigm and into the next one as fast as we can. And the problem we have, and I suppose this is where the governance stuff still comes in, is that they're not aligned. And if anything, the oil and gas sector is doing the opposite and sees itself as having a future ad nauseam and is in various ways seeking to rig the system and to secure public financing and to tweak environmental regulations to let it off the hook and so on and so forth. So we've got a really quite interesting moment, I think, in time, a global crisis. We've got lots of global crises, obviously, and COVID's not helping. But or bizarrely, it has on one level because it's killed the oil futures market. But we have a global crisis that we have to deal with because it represents an existential threat to all of us. And yet we have ESG type thinking coming into policy making in one space, which is great to see. But we equally have the central part of the problem, namely the fossil fuel sector, flexing its century-long historical corrupt, co-opting, sort of abusive overreach into the policy space and seeking to carry on as it has always done. So I think we're in this quite interesting moment where it's going to be interesting to see what our investigations can uncover and how well we can pursue these corporations for what they're doing.
So can you tell us about the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and where that fits in?
So the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative is a multi-stakeholder initiative. It's been around now since 2002. It was launched by the then Blair government in the UK. It's now an independent operation with a secretariat based in Oslo. So it has no political affiliation. So you can't label it as belonging to a government at all any longer. When I say multi-stakeholder initiative, it has companies and governments and civil society. The launch of EITI, as it's referred to in its acronym, was directly a political reaction to the launch of the Publish What You Pay campaign, which I'm a co-founder of. Publish What You Pay was a political demand for the disclosure of the payments made by extractive companies in every country of operation. The reason that's relevant, if we go back to the issue I was talking about before with Angola, we couldn't get the oil industry out, but we thought by forcing disclosure on them around the revenues they pay, after all, they must know how much they pay, right? We could create transparency around the income to the state and thereby empower citizens to hold their government to account for the looting of that money. And therefore hopefully create the conditions in which the revenue might benefit citizens rather than an elite taking it offshore. And also, of course, continuing the war in order to loot more. That, as you can imagine, is an extremely long fight, and you have to have all sorts of disclosures. We never imagined that disclosure of what, say, Exxon would pay or BP would pay would solve the problem. We saw it as a bit part. And there are other bits too, which you can, I'm sure, imagine from your work. I'm thinking of, disclosure of the beneficial owners of secret companies that are domiciled in, I don't know, everywhere from Delaware to the British Virgin Islands to other tax havens and so on, which have been notorious in allowing elites in countries like Angola, for example, perhaps the son of the president or whoever it happens to be, to set up a secret company, and that company then gets 10%, say, of a concession, and therefore 10% of the profit. They don't put anything into this at all. It's just a looting vehicle. So disclosures of beneficial owners creates the opportunity for citizens to say, hang on a minute, why is this piece of, why is this state asset, this oil block, being handed out to a company where 10% of it's owned by the president's offspring? This is outrageous. That's the thesis behind that. We're now, as a Publish What You Pay movement, adding other things that we want to see being disclosed, including disclosure of contracts. What are the contracts extractive companies have in the various countries of operation? What are the underlying fiscal terms that are determined by these contracts? What are the environmental what environmental disclosures could we require them to do? Mining companies, for example, in many places, very often behave in an appalling way. They don't follow the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. They don't turn up and work out how to operate in an area in harmony with citizens. Very often citizens first know about a mining concession when they turn up one morning and start digging. I'm dealing with an example like that in Honduras at the moment, where a mining company just turned up one day and started digging up the graveyard that was been there for 3 centuries. And of course, citizens were outraged. This was their relatives. And so they protested. And so what happened? The military showed up. What did the military do? Kill some people. The citizens complained. They were labeled terrorists. 7 of them are in jail, possibly facing 20 years. Meanwhile, there's no consequence for the killers. The killers carry on in impunity. There's no consequence for beatings. There's intimidation before the beatings. There's laws been passed which prohibit the release of information, so you can't even find out in the Honduras case who owns these companies and where is the concession contract. None of this stuff is available. Anyway, this is quite a complicated field, if you like, but what we've been trying to do as a movement is inject these additional components. And what EITI started off as, back to your original question, was a political response to this demand for a set of mandatory disclosure mechanisms that would force these disclosures on the companies so that they could be used to hold these companies to account. What we got instead was this multi-stakeholder initiative in which the central premise is citizens, NGOs in this case, because most of it will be through probably NGOs turning up and playing this role, would play the role of holding the other 2 parts to account, the other 2 participants, so the governments and the companies. And if you think what that means in a country like Honduras, what it should mean is we're talking about empowering citizens to participate in a governance process where they can criticize and expect results in terms of performance of behavior of the companies and government, thereby stopping the situation you find right now in Honduras of murder with impunity and other abuses. And so if you imagine the history of the extractive sector, going all the way back to conquistadors and other parts of the world by people like Livingston and all these other nice colonial era characters, and the modern day robber barons in charge of extractive companies, oil, gas and mining companies, that would represent a massive sea change in how things are done. But we're not there yet. So there continues to be a fight within this initiative, which has come, as I said, from this political response, kind of like an aspirational ask with no teeth, to a situation now, almost 2 decades later, where we have, under the EITI, what's called the EITI standard, a pretty good standard, but its efficacy or not all comes down to how it's interpreted and implemented. And that's where it gets interesting. So for my sins, I'm actually got my first sort of official role, as it were, within the EITI process. I never had any formal engagement, even though I've been there from the beginning. I'm now a civil society board member on the EITI. And so one of the things we've been trying to do is work as a set of board members, there's 10 of us, in order to both protect the standard, make sure it's implemented in the best, most people-centric way, and also to expand the standard to include additional disclosures that would deal with issues like the failure of companies to do effective and adequate environmental impact assessments, the failure of companies to bother to ask people whether it's okay to come and extract in their backyard, and climate risk disclosure type disclosures are other areas we want to try and bring in. And of course, this is a big fight because we're sitting at the table with governments, some of whom are murderers, or some of whom have elites who are murderers, and some companies, some of whom describe themselves as big blue chip companies, but actually, as we all know, behave in a reprehensible way. I mean, you only have to look at Chevron and its activity, with respect to the Ecuador situation, or we could look at another example. We are co-complainants with some other NGOs, the organization Recommon in Italy, the Corner House in the UK, and Header Resource Centre, a Nigerian NGO. We filed a complaint to the Milan Public Prosecutor's Office around a corrupt deal put together by Shell and Eni. Shell, you'll well know, it's the second largest oil company in the world. And Eni is Italy's largest corporation and a pretty reasonable sized oil company as well. They paid $1 billion in a corrupt deal that enabled them to get contractual terms that essentially stole the value that should have gone to the Nigerian state. Instead, it went to them. And what does that mean in cost? Well, it means approximately 2 years of the entire healthcare and education budget of Nigeria has gone to bankroll the companies. It's what they've taken. And they got that, we believe, courtesy of paying this $1 billion, which they knew would go to individuals at the highest level. And they helped design the mechanism by which they did it. So we filed this complaint, and they're currently on trial, and the trial is coming to an end slowly at the end of this year. We don't obviously want to preempt the outcome, and everyone, including the companies, have said that they're innocent. So we'll see how the court passes judgment on that. But the reality is this was a corrupt deal. This is a state asset that was stolen by a former oil minister who gave it to himself, and he flogs it for $1 billion to them, and the state got nothing. So from the perspective of what that word corruption means, very often in legalistic terms, it's sort of a, well, was that a breach of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or some other anti-corruption statute or not? No, okay, it's not corrupt. No, I think from my point of view, we have to reclaim what the word corrupt means. And by any dictionary definition of corruption, this was a corrupt deal. Whether it's illegal or not, we'll see. Let's see what the court does. But corrupt it certainly is. And these are some of the sort of things that we're dealing with in the context of trying to drive these disclosures and these accountability mechanisms forward. There's always this fight back by the corrupt.
But doesn't Shell sit on the board of EITI?
Yes, it does, as does Chevron. So it's going to be very interesting to see. I have no personal animus with either of the individuals on that. In fact, we've worked quite well together over the period. I mean, one of the interesting things about EITI is it's a place where I don't quite know how to put this exactly, where you arrive at a consensus. We don't always agree on stuff. And we do have, I suppose, conflagrations. That's an overstatement, I suppose. But we end up debating stuff vigorously. Let's put it that way. And we have gradually, incrementally moved forward. But I would actually say that the existence of the standard, it's taken us nearly 20 years to get to this stage, has been reached basically almost like a fight in the trenches. And it's been driven all the way by the civil society constituency. And it has been fought tooth and nail at various points by the companies and some governments that have been some of the more corrupt. Members of the board at different stages have sought to hold things back. So, for example, we had, as part of the standard, the obligation to disclose the beneficial owners of all project partners in an extractive project. And that was already part of the standard, I think, in I'm trying to remember now, by 2013. And it came in 2013 as an obligation by 2016, or somewhere around that time frame. And in the intervening years, Congo, Brazzaville, and Azerbaijan argued it back out again. And so it's only just become part of the standard this year. So what began in 2013 took till the beginning of this year now to get in place. So it gives you an idea of how long that fight can be.
Was the U.S. Dodd-Frank Act a result of the work at EITI?
No, separately to that, I consider the Section 1504 of the Dodd-Frank Act is essentially our first publish what you pay bill.
Wow.
We didn't write it, but it essentially, the US was the first mover, and actually deserves some credit for that, including in the Dodd-Frank Act, Section 1504, an early version of that, the language that ended up being used was drafted by some lawyers that we commissioned, and it way back though, I'm talking about 2003, that sort of time period, and that got touted around and it was fed for feedback, including to industry, and it got refined over the years, and it was sort of formally adopted by some two senators in both parties, and they were building support for it. It was going to run as a sort of standalone bill. I'm not sure how much confidence I had at the time that it would actually succeed at that point, but we thought, well, it's coming onto the floor, so if it doesn't happen this time, maybe next time. And they were really pushing it as their own thing by that stage, and had obviously, amended things and how they wanted it. And it was pretty good. And then the financial crisis happened. So it just took all the wind out of thinking around things like that. But what was fascinating was that in the course of the construction of what became the Dodd-Frank Act, it's got many components in it, and this resurfaced at a certain point, and the respective Senators Lugar and Senator Cardin pushed it at the time with support from others, and it went through. And then we had Obama signed it into law, I think in June or July 2010. But we still do not have an operational rule promulgated by the SEC. Here we are in 2020. So we're now 10 years after it became law, and it is not yet functional, even though the Europeans already by 2013 had started working on their own version. And it came into play, I'm trying to remember now, 2016, 2015, 2016. So that's been in play now for years. The sky hasn't fallen in, but what we continue to see is Exxon and Chevron in particular, through the American Petroleum Institute, pushing some minimalist version in an attempt to undermine the global standard that has begun to be set around project level disclosures. And that's really problematic. One of the ironies for me is, had Shell and Eni had to disclose, according to Dodd-Frank section 1504, let me rephrase that. Had the SEC promulgated the first rule for section 1504 in the congressionally mandated time they were obliged to do, and of course we all realized politically that was impossible because there were just too many rules to do, but had they done it, I do not think Shell and Eni would have done the corrupt deal for OPL 245 because they would have had to disclose that they had paid more than $1 billion into an account that was not the official recipient account for extractive payments. They were obliged under the Constitution to pay into something called the Federation account. Instead, it went into a special escrow account set up for the purpose. They would have had to disclose that, and they went ahead on the premise that they would not have to disclose it, and they didn't. So nobody knew about it.
If they did disclose it, it would be what? Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It would have been.
Well, I don't think the deal would have existed.
What?
I don't think the deal would have existed. They would have gone, oh my God, we're going to come out in public. And what they were relying on, this is my view, and as I think is the standard across multiple extractive projects in multiple countries, is their reliance on the opacity of the situation where everything's covered up, nobody gets to know anything of any substance. So you simply can't tell whether anything was legitimate or not. And our whole thesis, it doesn't solve everything. And like I said, it has to have these other components too. But our whole thesis is it becomes much harder to pay $1 billion in the wrong place if you have to disclose you made that payment and where you paid it to. But if you don't have to disclose it, and you don't, then nobody knows anything. You just wake up one day and, oh, those companies have now got that concession. Well, how did they get that? What did they pay for? Where did the money go? No record anywhere. So that's really what I think was quite an interesting moment in time. If the SEC had got its act together, I don't think the deal for OPL 245 would have happened. I guess they could have probably sped it up a little bit and done it earlier. So maybe that's all a hypothetical, silly example. But my point rests that it's kind of bizarre that the day they were supposed to have done it by is about 10 days before they concluded that deal. And they went ahead with that deal in the full knowledge they would not have had to disclose anything, and in fact didn't. So it remained covered up until two middle guys who got ripped off because they worked on what we've sort of internally called Plan A, which never happened. The deal that was constructed was Plan B, cutting them out the loop. But one of the middle guys was pissed off about it, so he filed a lawsuit in the Southern District, and out came, bingo, all these nice papers, which showed exactly who'd been doing what, and that was the beginning of the end. So it was just a very interesting insight into the normality, I think, of many extractive deals. And for me, it's, that plus the myriad other case studies we've looked at over the years, it's not a surprise that none other than the OECD, looking at various sectors, industrial sectors, concluded that the extractive sector is the most corrupt on the planet. And certainly from my experience, I would place the oil and gas industry as the most corrupt of the extractive sector on top of everyone else by a long shot.
That's saying a lot. Well, what do you think? Okay, we're going to just take a left turn here for a second. We know this, right? The lack of transparency is corruption by omission, right? It's like, okay, no record. Isn't that on its face? Shouldn't that on its face be obvious it's corruption? And we all know this. Everyone knows. And yet everyone being civil society, who's not Simon Taylor, who's not Global Witness, and all of the organizations, working in suit, it's interesting to me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. You spent your lifetime, right, working on these issues, and everyone else knows too, and yet we go along with our lives with kind of this shade of cognitive dissonance, like pretending we don't know. And right? I mean, so with that and knowing what we all know that we can't unknow because somewhere in our psyche lives that knowing, but we just choose to turn a blind eye to it because we have to go along with our daily life. What do you think is the biggest lever point right now to reverse this situation and really wake people up. I mean, mainstream up. Because and I want to say, because right now there is this mainstreaming of responsibility, corporate responsibility, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. There's just like so much in the field now compared to when we began. And we're still here. We're still here, and it's like the same almost, right? So what is the lever point?
I almost feel like what we've been doing is starting from nothing and building an infrastructure that will create the circumstances in which it's no longer possible to do these kind of things. But one of the things I think, I'm trying to remember whether it was somebody you've interviewed. I heard some of your podcasts, and I forget who said this, but I think it was Nadine, actually. She was talking about you work on something and you get it fixed, and then you have to start all over again and do it again. So I'm a firm believer that corruption is grand corruption. I mean, corruption itself is a sort of ranges from a petty cash in envelopes thing that we all can imagine, all the way through to the co-option and capture of entire states and their looting. So there's a huge spectrum in there, and it impacts on so many, I suppose, parts of our society. It's not just a phenomenon of extractive sector, but why it's so important in the case studies we're talking about is we're talking about states in which the bulk of the state's income has come from these extractive projects, and yet it's all disappearing. And this is not just about kleptocratic leaders who loot their states. It takes two to dance a tango, and the companies are very often, more often than not, I would say, highly complicit in that arrangement. They know exactly what's going on and are willing participants in the full knowledge that the opacity of the arrangements they have guarantees them an ability to set up deals like this, because there is no consequence. And if you get caught out, the worst possibly that might happen is a fine, which is usually not commensurate with the damages caused and quite often can be written off as the cost of doing business. I mean, just look at the fines HSBC paid for laundering money for the two Mexican drug cartels during a period in which 50,000 people died. I'm forgetting the figure now. It was something like $1.9 billion. And you think, brilliant, good on Southern District of New York. They did a good hit on HSBC for terrible malfeasance. I agree, it's a lot of money. But if you add that up over 10 years worth of the crimes that they were found liable for through their deferred prosecution agreement, it comes down to something like 20 days profit, or 20 days of their annual profit every year. No one went to jail. There was no consequence for anyone individually. Maybe a few people got sacked, probably some lower flunkies. The boss of HSBC went on to become the UK's trade minister for a year. He knew what was going on. He was personally briefed, according to the report that came out of then Senator Cardin's, what the hell was it called? The Senate Subcommittee on Investigations did a lot of work in this area and uncovered the fact that the boss of HSBC Mexico had personally informed the boss of HSBC that the teller windows in Mexico had been enlarged to ensure larger suitcases of cash could be brought through the teller windows. I mean, he knew about it, did nothing about it for a year or something like that. So my point is that the consequences are inadequate from the law enforcement side, and what we've come from is nothing. I remember first going to Washington when we'd started our work on the oil issue in Angola, and I remember going around the State Department or somewhere, I forget now, but someone in a government body of one description or another, but it was kind of uniform, and I was basically saying, look, we need to see oil companies having to disclose their payments, and that met absolute hysterical laughter. I mean, it's very hard to imagine today how ridiculous an assumption that might have been, given, as you said, there are all these things. There's the Ruggie principles you referred to, and so on and so forth. But there was nothing then. We had just had the beginnings of what was it, the US-UK voluntary principles beginning to be considered, the sort of the nascent beginning of what became known as corporate social responsibility, which I, on a personal level, can see, some improvements in some areas, but largely I see as a bit of a corporate propaganda exercise. But here, if you wind the clock forward to today, we have a panoply of mechanisms that are beginning to shape and work interactively together. And that's, I think, one of the interesting bits of where the EITI space is now. If we as a board can make sure that the standard is refined further and implemented in the spirit in which it was intended, I think we do have the prospect of doing the best we can in holding companies to account and their counterparts in governments around the extraction of natural resources. What's missing is the climate component. We need to deal with the fact we cannot afford new extraction of fossil fuels as a global society. So we've got to incorporate measures to deal with that. Where we're failing, I think, though, is around law, on the governance of extractive sector. We're failing around the law enforcement side. Law enforcement is glacial. The system is corrupted, it's dysfunctional. When you do MLA requests with corrupt states, then it gets blocked at various stages. If civil society organizations help you on the ground, they get persecuted. Law enforcement, when they become too good, get changed. We're just seeing this in Nigeria right now. The amazing boss of what's known as the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, who've been instrumental in doing a brilliant set of investigations into the OPL 245 scandal I mentioned and other corruption cases in Nigeria. He's just, the boss has just been removed from his post by the Attorney General, who we have serious concerns about, as to his behavior around dealing with the anti-corruption drive of the president. He seems at his every step to be undermining it. And he's just removed the best head we've had of that institution in years. I think, my own opinion, because he started to investigate people who can't be touched. And so as the first boss of the EFCC said, if you fight corruption, it fights back. And that would appear to be the case. So we've always got to be vigilant about these things. And so to sum that bit up, I think we need to make sure these standards are up to the task, and that would mean, I think, constant evolution. And we've got to ensure that the oversight and enforcement of these standards is done well, which it often isn't. And we need other disincentives to go with it, because these companies often behave in a ruthless way. If you don't nail it down, they'll steal it. That's literally what one sees all the time. So I'm optimistic, but this fight never ends, I think.
Yeah, if you fight corruption, it fights back. I'm curious.
It certainly does.
Yeah, well, that's how we met, Simon.
Exactly. Well, how else would you describe that arrangement with Chevron?
Right.
Other than an incredibly corrupt set of circumstances. It may not be, we wait to see. Obviously, no court has passed judgment on any kind of investigation that's had any credibility into the goings on. But I cannot look at what's happened after 20 years of looking at the corruption space writ large and see anything other than an entirely corrupt process. It's an obscenity. How else could you describe it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I used to read the reports of Global Witness around the killings of environmental defenders and human rights defenders. And I would always say, well, where's the United States? Like, I had actually had a friend in the United States killed. There are people killed with impunity here in the United States who are justice defenders. So, and from that too, it's the same thing here. We are looking, and for those listening, if you haven't listened to this podcast to get the background episode, look for the episode with Steven Donziger. He is currently under house arrest. He's a human rights attorney, a Harvard-based attorney who took on Chevron 27 years ago, was representing indigenous communities and farmer communities in the Amazon and Ecuador, holding Texaco Chevron to account for
the Amazon Chernobyl, yeah.
Amazon Chernobyl, yeah. So here we are today and we're watching the Southern District of New York, the court, the judge, we're watching what appears to be corruption. That's what Simon is referring to. From all of your experience, is it like surprising to you that it's happening here in the United States, or is this just par for the course, and that it continues to unfold without, like, it's so blatant to us, right?
Yeah. I think it's a difficult one. Well, it's not difficult, really. I suppose I think I have long seen the US, a country that projects an image as an outsider. I'm trying to sort of relate this from that perspective. It projects itself as a country that follows the rule of law, and yet the rule of law as practiced all too often, and I say this with a large dollop of ignorance because clearly I'm very familiar with some bits of it, very unfamiliar with large dollops of it. So, you may have a slightly different view or a different way of framing it, but I have the impression that the rule of law means one thing if you're very wealthy and well resourced, and it means something entirely different if you have nothing. If you're one of the unmoneyed class, whatever, and even worse, if you're not in a white ethnic group, you have serious problems with the law in a sort of asymmetry of deployment against you.
Or if you're representing them.
Or if you're representing them, as we found. I mean, one of the things I found really shocking, it was just a silly anecdote and sort of pales perhaps into insignificance against, all the due process failures that Steven has been facing. But the idea that one of the people associated with the killing of George Floyd is on the street at a lesser bail than Steven, whose entire underpinning of literally everything that he faces would appear to hang on the perjured witness testimony of a corrupt, and everyone knew it, he admitted it, corrupt former Ecuadorian judge who told the third version of his story of events. For the listeners, none of the other three versions seemingly being consistent in any of the central claims that he made, having been paid by Chevron to turn up. That, my understanding is, you can't pay a fact witness. I could bring you from Ecuador, as we're talking about Ecuador, I could put you up in a nice hotel in Manhattan, I can take you out for the theater and feed you well and all the rest of it, but I cannot put you on a stipend. And there he is being paid regularly. What was the figure? Some 50 times his income. He was offering his services for money, and as the money got better or he demanded more, the story changed and became more what Chevron appeared to want to hear. He's now admitted he lied on the stand. He was coached for 53 days. I mean, this is a judge. You would think a judge would know something about how to present himself on the point of interview in a court scenario, right? You'd think he'd know the story he was there to relate. Why did he need coaching for 53 days and not just for 10 minutes? We're talking hours each occasion. I mean, when I first heard that, I thought, did he have to learn his lines? When you add all those components up, you're just left with something. I can't think of a better way of describing it other than this utterly stinks. So the questions I would have to both the lawyers working for Chevron, but also the judge, at what point did you consider perjury in your courtroom from a paid fact witness, which I believe is, not a legal thing to do, from a corrupt witness, has any credibility at all? And if you pull that out, how does any of the rest of it stack up? And if none of the rest of it stacks up, all the other things that have come since stink too. I mean, that's kind of where I end up with that. I can't. I've read a lot of the documents. I obviously haven't read everything because there's too many pages, but I just cannot see how there is credibility to any of the processes that are unfolding at the moment. And you don't need to be a rocket scientist or a lawyer to see that. So back to your sort of question about the function of law and who it serves, it really feels like this is a case of I'm bigger than you and you can just go jump in the lake and I'm going to win and there's nothing you can do about it. And that stinks. Is that accountability? Is that a country of law, or is that just an abusive system? I would say the latter.
Yeah, and I just would add the most brilliant piece of the story recently being that the judge when the judge with the criminal contempt charge, the judge appointed a private prosecutor that has Chevron as a client. Their law firm has Chevron as a client. So the thing is, like, we go into the details and everything that you're sharing, Simon, it's just, I love it from the beginning when you're talking about how evidence could really move mountains. And then we get to a point where it feels like and this is from my perspective, I'm here to awaken consciousness on the planet. So really raising the vibration so people can actually see the evidence, because it's there. Yeah. It's here. Yeah. Here it is, right? Go to globalwitness.org. It's there. Yeah. And what is going on with this, like I referred to it before, cognitive dissonance. And so in this, what would you say to people who really who see it and they could just go on with their day, right? For you, that's not okay. This is your life. You're committing to this. Well, what do you say to people who see it and get it, but they shut the blind eye?
I suppose, I mean, there's many different ways to think about that. I suppose it really depends on the issue that is before you. I mean, the reason that sounds like a bit of a get out, because I would hope the information and evidence before you would motivate people to do something. It doesn't cost very much to make a noise about something, to ring someone up and say, excuse me, what's going on? I would wager a bet if 20 people wrote a letter, an eloquent letter, we used to write letters, right, to the Southern District of Manhattan and said, what the heck is going on with this ridiculous prosecution? It stinks. That would freak out the system, right? And that sounds like perhaps a non-credible way of sort of pursuing. It's a difficult space, because one of the things we've been doing, and one of the things I find sort of difficult to reconcile in this case is, all the criticism I just made of the U.S. legal system being one where pay to play gets you somewhere, and if you haven't got anything, you've had it. There's lots of evidence of that, obviously, but at the same time, if I compare the Southern District of Manhattan and its action against the corrupt with, say, London, which I see as an epicenter of laundering of the worst kind, and no political will, and inadequate laws until recently, and a vast amount of money to beat up anyone through libel laws or other laws who takes on this kind of stuff, then the Southern District of Manhattan can wave its stand up high and proud. I'm critical of things like the deferred prosecution agreement against HSBC, because everyone lauds 1.9 billion as a fine. It's great. But HSBC didn't really admit guilt, even though, like I said, it laundered $7 billion on behalf of the drug cartels, during which time 50,000 people died. So if that's not, laundering the wherewithal of people who killed a lot of other people, I'd like to know what is. And so I would have thought that should have cost a bit more than that, like some people in jail. And that's my hope. I mean, obviously,
invest $7 billion. And sorry, invest $1 billion. What is it? Invest $1 billion to get $7 billion back, basically.
No. You're well. Yes, I suppose. Yeah. I suppose in that example. But I mean, in the case of Shell and Eni, I don't want to preempt the outcome, and I can't say those people are guilty of any particular crime, because the court has to decide that, and I can't preempt that, obviously. And they've denied things. Fine, but if they're found guilty, this is the case that's taking place in Milan. It would be good, in my view, if those senior executives, and we're talking about the CEO of Eni and the predecessor CEO of Eni and other top officials, and in the Shell case, the former number 2 in the company who reported directly to the CEO, they should go to jail. And the reason I say that, and I don't say that with relish, because the thought of putting anyone in jail makes me sort of cringe. Jail is not a nice proposition. But I don't think these are going to be jails like you would find in the depths of, I don't know, DRC or somewhere like that. They're not going to go to some hideous, dangerous place, I suspect, and it won't be for that long, because this will be seen as a white-collar crime, and white-collar criminals don't seem to go to jail for very long, even though if you steal 2 years of the healthcare and education budget combined in a country like Nigeria, some people are going to die. You may not have appreciated because you were so arrogant you didn't think about it. But if you did stop and think about it, that's what the income is. And in my view, it's not credible to not know that if you can find the country on a world map. Do you know what I mean? So some of this stuff is so blatant. This is the kind of thing that needs to happen. So I would like to see a tightening up of consequence for crimes like looting of countries and rigging of political systems, such that we can't get political decision making in the public interest, because the consequences are deaths of many people. Abstract ones, they may be over here, out of sight and out of mind, but you know there's a big consequence. We're not there yet. But leaving aside all of that, generally speaking, I would see the Southern District as a place we've had good relationship with, we've worked well with over the years, and I'm impressed by what some of the things they've done. But what the heck is going on with Steven and Chevron and the Ecuador case? There's something really rotten at the core in how that has unfolded. And it seems to me it's a massive stain on the otherwise reputation of the Southern District. I mean, you as a lawyer may be familiar with other cases, but this one just seems to stick out in such an ugly way. And when you look at all the things they should have done but haven't done, and the sort of abuses of due process, it's sort of like one thing after the other. A couple of mistakes, okay, fine, but over and over again, it's really shocking.
If we zoom out from just a higher level and look at what's happening, it's the same thing with, I mean, I really do equate the microcosm to the macro, how we as humans continue to, do something that's really out of alignment with our own values. And we just continue to do that. And how can we do that even though we know it might be causing harm for our bodies or our lives? And I really do think that what's happening in the courts, what's happening in the world, what's happening with the extractive industry is a macrocosm of how we as humans are sort of complicit and colluding with the story, this narrative, right? Because it's comfortable in a way, even with the corruption, it's comfortable for people because they don't have to change. We don't have to really erupt and have a revolution, which is, what you're working towards avoiding by putting in the systems and standards. But one of the things I see with the court, when I really look at the situation, when we get in the weeds, it's mind-boggling. But when we really just step into our heart, and this might sound a little woo-woo, but when we step into our place of our heart and we look at what's really going on, it's just like it's just like testing. It's testing how far can we push this, and how obvious can it be, and we can still get away with it. And
that's what it feels like, yeah.
Right? And I think this is just a microcosm of every other big issue we're dealing with. So I feel like in this part of the answer to the bigger question before around what's the lever point for really reversing the issues right now, it's about the personal responsibility in every way, right?
It's absolutely about personal responsibility. And think about what you're doing when you're doing it. When you buy that next phone because you need a new phone, do you really need the new phone? Or could you buy one that doesn't involve minerals out of Eastern DRC? That's a bit facile because there are so many examples of that. But your purchasing choices can make a difference. There's some industrial sectors that thrive on flogging the next model that's really cheap, and the purchasing of raw materials to make those commodities to feed this insatiable demand that's very often, if you stop to think about it for a second, unnecessary. Do we really need a new phone every year? I mean, isn't that ridiculous when you think about it for a second? And so on. There's many things one could do. If you are going to have a phone every year, how much effort? Probably less effort than you spent in the queuing up to get the latest Apple phone. Not that I'm picking on Apple beyond anyone else, I hasten to add, but probably less effort than standing in the queue waiting to buy that latest model you were desperate to have, to write a letter and say, excuse me, what's going on here? And so, if I had an appeal, an instant appeal, just thinking about Steven's situation alone, what would happen if 20 people who are listening to this hopefully picked up a pen and paper or a computer and wrote a letter to the Southern District and demanded an explanation for the appalling litany of due process failures that appear to be operating in a vacuum in the court processes that have been used to, in my view, persecute Steven and his colleagues. They are denying the solution, which would be that Chevron should pay up because it was found liable. It should pay up. why hasn't it paid up? Because it's got the judicial process to bully its opponents. And when you think how many people are suffering as a consequence of that, that's just simply not acceptable, I think, not in a credible world. So I don't know, we can as a society go forth and sort of pretend that's not happening, but it is happening. And it seems to me, if this can happen to Steven, a person who's come out of Harvard Law School, this can happen to anybody. So I don't think anyone should sit there on their laurels going, oh, well, it's just those people over there, I don't have to worry about it. This can happen to anyone, and we should be very concerned everywhere that this kind of behavior is challenged. I think we all have a moral obligation to stand up and do it in our own way. It doesn't mean you have to go on a picket line. It doesn't mean you have to do very much. But let's face it, writing a letter or ringing someone up or contacting your MP or your congressperson or wherever you are is not a hugely costly effort. It's just something I think so many people have either never got into the habit of, or got now so long out of the habit of.
Well, I think there's the idea that it doesn't work. You go online now and you click in a form, and where's that going? But on that note, if anybody does want to get involved or do anything in respect to Steven Donziger, you can just email me, and I will happily plug you in.
Yes, I encourage you. Thank you.
You've probably pissed a number of people off in your global movement to drive accountability, right? Working against behemoths. So yeah. Have you ever been scared? Have you ever thought, I got to stop this. I'm just going to throw in the towel. I can't deal with this anymore. Have you ever received threat?
We've been legally threatened loads of times. I used to be, I described what happened when we launched our oil work in Angola, and within days we were threatened with a lawsuit by someone that the Angolan government at the time put up to do it. And that terrified me, because I thought, bloody hell, we're 5 years down or whatever it was. No, not 5 years down, by then, a few years down, and I suppose I felt like really struggled against the odds to get to where we'd got to, and we had some kind of viability going as an institution, and we were doing, I thought, good work, and suddenly we were faced with this potential to lose everything, even though we knew we were right, and there was nothing. I felt this horrible, sickening, sliding feeling. So I didn't really sleep very well, I suppose, for a few months, but I've learned a lot since then, and I mentioned earlier that the use of the law to go on the offensive, hence filing complaints, but also having a very robust, due process of checks and balances when you put your material together. How do you know what you know? What's the evidence of it? Making sure you don't overstate the validity of the material. So what we put out, never say never, and you can always make mistakes, and if you do, you should apologize. But by and large, I think we have not been guilty of overstating things. We've tried to, we might make fun of a baddie at their expense, but it's predicated around evidence we feel we can stack up. And I think that's an artistic license that is legitimate given the consequences of their activities. So with that, I felt, I wouldn't say emboldened probably is the right term, but I wouldn't want that to sound reckless. I'm very conscious of the fact that doing what we do in a lot of places would get you murdered. I am always conscious of the legal threat. On the other side, threats, no, not really, because I think it would be really stupid. Maybe that's naive too, because obviously, as look at what Chevron has been doing with Steven. And I'm not saying that to invite anyone who might be considering having a go at us, but I think when we publish something, we feel pretty certain of what we're saying, and so we're not just going to roll over. If people want to go after us when we've got material that supports our position, we would defend ourselves, and vigorously too. So that's never a guarantee, is it? But in terms of threats, no, I not for a long time. I was quite scared on and off when we went around the Thai border, because if we had messed up, we'd have been across the border with the Khmer Rouge and they were murdering people. So it wasn't a particularly nice prospect. But I suppose in our naivety and youth, we thought it'll be fine because we have a good cover and we'll stick to it. But maybe when I look back on that, I think how stupid that was. It could have gone wrong, I suppose.
Well, Simon, we need your courage. Everyone listening needs more than a dose of your courage. So in closing, what would be one nugget of wisdom about courage that you would like to share with the millions of people listening to this conversation?
Oh my goodness. I think the courage comes from a humble appreciation of the facts. Make sure, if you're trying to change something, articulate it. I mean, there's many different ways to articulate things, of course, whether it's a tweet 1 minute or walking around Capitol Hill another minute, or whoever else, or whichever other country you might be in, or writing a blog. It doesn't really matter. But one should be humble to the facts. Don't exaggerate things. The evidence, if you look for it, depends on the issue, obviously, and sometimes you can't find the evidence. We've certainly been in that point where we're pretty certain something's going on but cannot stack it up, and we don't say it. And that's really frustrating because you still think you're right, but you can't justify saying it, so you don't. So I think stick to your facts, be truthful, and have confidence in what you're saying, and that emboldens you, not in a reckless way, but to go forth with measured consideration and to get it right. That would be my hope, and that I think that gives you the courage because you know you're right. Obviously, that can sound arrogant as hell. I don't mean it that way. I mean, don't overstate your case, but rely on the facts, and then you should have the confidence that you're right. That's, I think, what I'm trying to say.
Well, and what we're up against is a huge industry and paradigm that asserts a certain set of facts and claims they're right, even if we know they're not. And so it is so incumbent upon us to really align and speak our truth. So I'm so grateful for you and this beautiful conversation. I could talk to you for hours about your heroic stories on the field. Thank you so much, Simon. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Catalyst Talks. Stay tuned for what's up next, and please subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen. You'll find those links at catalysttalks.com. Join us. We continue this conversation on social media, and if you'd like to reach out to me privately, you can send me a message at stephanietrager.com. Your attention here means the world to me. Thank you, thank you, thank you.